Welcome everyone. Today we'll talk about elements of risk analysis, the hazards and the vulnerability thereof. So basically to understand risk is all about you being vulnerable and the type of hazard that one is supposed to face. So yes, the elements of risk analysis are vulnerability and the hazard thereby. So what is the agenda? To understand the various hazards, what are the impacts that plays on us, has an impact on us, the basic dimensions of vulnerability as how resilient you are or how vulnerable you are, how much stronger you are to face any difficult situation, disaster per se, or how weak you are as in vulnerability quotients are concerned as facing in in terms of a dire circumstances or disaster per se. The concepts of multi-hazard exposure, susceptibility, and resilience. So yes, we are going to talk about multiple hazards. Let's say there's an earthquake and there's an ongoing pandemic, perhaps, or there's a virus outbreak, perhaps, or there's a terrorism strike, perhaps, or there's acute weather, extreme weather, if I say so, along with the earthquake. So multi-pronged hazards, the exposure, and how resilient you are. What is your susceptibility quotient thereby? So understand the spatial dimensions, definitely yes, and the temporal component of hazard analysis, progressions of the vulnerability with definite cause as to why certain things happens, the dynamic pressures and what impact does it place around it, and what are the conditions which needs to be avoided, or should I say about the unsafe conditions. So yes, we are talking about scales, yes, we are talking about sectors, and definitely the components of vulnerability analysis. So sectors, scales, and components of vulnerability analysis, the useful indicator for you to understand the analysis part of it. And definitely yes, how do we couple up, interact between hazard and vulnerability, or how do we come out from dire circumstances into normalcy, and that is what we'll be talking around here. So yes, the basic elements of hazard, the basic understanding of vulnerability, and what impact does it plays and how do we fight it along with it, that is what the crux of this particular video is concerned. I've just given you a random map. So in this cases, since we have a global audiences, this map depicts the United States of America, and it shows relatively the shaking hazard, the earthquake hazard prone zone of United States. And probably if this is the case, this is Puerto Rico. If you're going around it, look what happens. Puerto Rico is 99% hazard prone or earthquake prone, which is not the case with USA. So that needs to be understood, understand. So everything has been marked with in different colors. You will see the probability of shaking increases from very low white to moderate light blue, green, yellow, and to high as in orange, pink, red. Blue dots are nothing but past earthquakes, as in where the earthquakes have actually happened. So hazard analysis describes and assesses the probability of an occurrence. What is the probability of a natural disaster uh, happening in your area? It is 50%, 60%, 70%, or 99%. So what are, in which prone zone you are looking into it? What are the kind of hazard that goes around it? It can be extreme natural events in cases of a typhoon, hurricane, tsunamis, floods, in cases of earthquake, in cases of pandemic, in cases of extreme weather, droughts, or snowing. So that needs to be understand with the duration and the intensity of what the disaster is all about it. So where, how big, and how often, how frequently it is going to happen. Is it a seasonal thing? Is it happening once, twice, thrice in a year? Is it happening once in a blue moon, once in 5 years, or once in 10 years, in a decade? So output is the severity of the output that we go around here, and that is what needs to be understood as far as hazard analysis is concerned. So where, how big, and how often is what we are looking into it. So spatial analysis would say which areas are potentially threatened. Probability of happening disaster is more often. Analyze the extent of the impact area and what kind of facilities, what kind of inhabitation is there in that particular area. So analyze that area very minutely, try to find out what can be your shelter zone, try to find out what can be your strength, what are the resources that can be mobilized, and what resources can get extreme Dimension analysis is something that we need to understand as how bad it can be, how disastrous it can be, how dire it can be. That is what the dimensions we need to go around it. So yes, we need to analyze the local characteristics, what intensity and the forces do hazards occur, and at what scale that hazard occur. Then comes the temporal analysis, when and how often are the future hazard to be expected. Analyze frequencies, duration of hazard events, interval of recurrences thereby. That needs to be understood time and again as the case might be. So yes, where, how big, and how often is all about your spatial analysis, dimensional analysis, and temporal analysis. So remember which areas, the spatial analysis, dimensional analysis is the degree of the impact that it goes to have happen, and temporal analysis is what is the probability of it being happening around here. So multi-hazard analysis. This is a map. If you want to go around, this is a map of a Sri Lanka. It says analysis of only single hazard in an area might lead to misjudgment of the all hazards risk of these areas as the case might be. That is what needs to be understood. You cannot fixate that only one type of hazard is going to frequent that place, only it's an earthquake prone zone. Probably it can be an earthquake prone zone, probably it can also be multi-prone by extreme temperature, be it drought or be it snowing, or be there might be a pandemic around it, or there might be economic hazard around it. So you need to understand those things. Indexing can be one way to combine the different hazards in one particular map, as we have showed about the hazard index around here. Hazard may be weighted equally, or weights can be assigned based on the frequency of each hazards. Comparison between impact of different natural hazards on a population are more correctly performed by examining risk rather than hazard indicators. That is what is very important per se. Vulnerability, the paradox is measuring vulnerability without precisely defining it. That is one thing that needs to be understood. We need to be focusing of what is expected and what is not. Vulnerability defined as conditions determined by physical, social, economic, environmental factors or processes which process probably enhance the susceptibility of a community. And that is what United Nations disaster risk management is telling it to you, the United Nations International Society for Disaster and Risk Assessment. This is what we are going around it. So vulnerability is just a definitions of a condition determined by not only physical, probably how physically you will be attacked, social, probably how the fabrics of community is going to be stringent or get loosened, economically is how the money flow or probably the livelihood is going to be impacted, environmentally is how the ecology will change over a period of time, which increases the susceptibility of the community to impact of hazard. And that is what vulnerability is all about it. Remember, it is a condition determined by physical, social, economic, environmental factors where the community is susceptible. Multi-structures of vulnerability is all about exposures, is all about values, fragility, susceptibility, coping capacity, and resilience. Now, these are my three parameters that goes around it. Your exposures or the value that it is going to erode, fragility or susceptibility, whether you are going to spring back to normalcy or not, or for how long will it take for you to spring back to the normalcy. And the third one will be the coping capacity or the resiliences that you are going to build around here. So progression of vulnerability, there are only three stages. You need to find out the root causes. Now, what are the root causes? It might be the access to power, access to structure, access to resources. Resources can be in kind or in cash. Ideologies may be political system or the economic system. Next is the dynamic pressure. Now, this is where the legal framework comes in. This is where the institution comes in. This is where the training comes in. This is where the federal government comes in. This is where the skills of the community comes in, how resilient they are. The press freedom comes in, ethical standards for public life. Now, this is what dynamic pressure is all about it. And what are the macro forces? It can be the dwindling population, or it can be enhancing population, increasing population change. It can be rapid urbanization or rapid transformation into a rural sectors? What is happening? Is there a migration of people happening in that particular fragile ecosystem or in that particular area? What exactly are my dynamic pressures? Next is your unsafe condition, which is the physical environment, dangerous location, unprotected building and infrastructures. Economy is livelihood at risk, be it a low income group, social relationship, population at risk, the lack of solidarity, public action is and the institution, the lack of disaster preparedness. Now, what are we disaster? We talk about it. We talk about disaster in terms of earthquake, in terms of cyclones, tsunamis, hurricanes, in terms of floods, in kind of volcanoes eruptions, landslide, drought, viruses, pest, locust, infestation, you name it and we have it. And these are only natural hazards that have counted around it. There are man-made hazards as in chemical spillage, oil spillage, probably terrorism. There are biochemical attack. There's a nuclear war. These are man-made threats. You know, this is going to happen or this might happen. The likelihood of either of them getting triggered is very high, be it the natural born hazards or the man-made hazard per se. Now is the time we need to understand a framework of vulnerability, as in what is your exposure in terms of temporal. Temporal, remember, is the frequency of the hazards hitting that place. Spatial is the area that is going to be impacted upon it. That is what your hazard framework would go around it. Now, what is your susceptibility, fragility, or should I say resilience you might have or lack of it? So this is what we need to go around it. It's all about physical, social, ecological, economical, cultural, and institutional. This is susceptibility in top. And the lack of resilience is how well are you prepared as a community to face any kind of hazardous situation. What is your capacity to cope up with? Do you have the capacity to recover, spring back to normalcy as early as possible? This is what vulnerability is all about it. Then the hazard intervention is reducing your exposures to vulnerability, fragility, susceptibility reduction, and probably improvement in your resilience. The courage, the fact that you are staying in a fragile environment where disaster are supposed to happen, but you are going to fight it back and probably come back, build back better. So yes, we talk about resilience in capacity of an individual, community, organization, city, nations to respond and cope and recover from disaster. Resilience in physical and social system can be seen as having four infrastructural qualities. That is all about robustness, the inherent strength or resistance in a system to withstand external demand without any form of degradation or loss of functionality. Then we have redundancy, system properties that allow for alternative source choices, substitution under stress. Resourcefulness, the capacity to mobilize needed resources, needed services in emergencies. Rapidity, the speed with which disruptions can overcome and safety services. Financial stability being restored as early as possible. That is what we are looking to build resilience. Remember, resilience is all about redundancy, robustness, resourcefulness, and rapidity. How fast can you react? How better can you react? As in robustness, how faster you can go up, come back to normalcy, redundancy, ensure that whatever the existing processes were all about it, you can find another better way to mitigate certain disasters. That can only be done you have got enough of resources. Remember, resources is not only money. Resources is something called your mental attitude altogether, that you are going to fight it out. You are going to develop skills that is required to uplift the community altogether. So that is what we are looking into it. Resilience in form of robustness, redundancy, resourcefulness, and rapidity. Vulnerability dependency on hazards is the degree of vulnerability of an infrastructure, a community, a society, or a process should be related to the magnitude of hazard in question through fragility curves. Now, this is what we are looking into it. Remember, on the x-axis is the magnitude. On the y-axis, we are building destruction or calamities, or should I say, the impact around here. Now, you need to form this curve. Can it be resilient? Can it go smaller and smaller? So there are no, or should I say, less sense of destruction, despite whatever the magnitude of hazards are all about it, some level of destruction. We need to flatten this curve. That is what we are looking into it. This is what is known as fragility curves or fragility functions per se. So scales and sectors and probably the component of vulnerability. If we look into it, this is a three-pronged matrix where we are trying to build it on x-axis. X-axis is sectors, y-axis is scale of consideration, and the z-axis is all about your components of vulnerability. Remember, this is a three-pronged axis that we are trying to do around it. Under sectors would be your housing, basic lifelines, health, education, agriculture, energy, infrastructure, commerce, you name it and we have it, be it industry, finance and telecommunication. But what about the scales on a national level, on a local level, on a district level, on a absolutely on a community level, probably a single house or probably an individual. Now these are your scales where disasters or hazard can go around it. So electricity missing just in your house is a hazardous position for you because electricity is not there in your house, but rest of the places in the locality everybody has house electricity. So that's an individual level. But if what happens, the whole society or the community does not have electricity, but rest of the nation, district, everybody has electricity, something might have gone to a wrong with the transformer. Whatever the state level, provincial level, where something goes missing and in the grid, the electricity gets malfunction and the state gets a blackout. Similarly, you are just only enhancing the scale. What is a component of vulnerability? Now, this is very interesting because it differs from society to society. The component of physical attributes, certain people are individually very resilient, as a race, as a community, very resilient. And you might be glorifying example would be there are communities where the average age of human being is much higher than in other countries. So you need to understand that that's the physical attributes. Then we have the functional attributes, the economic attributes, the gender, the administrative natures, and the environmental factors to be built around here. We talk about the indicators of vulnerability. Many aspects of vulnerability cannot be measured directly, believe me, but or even observed, but they can be described, they can be felt, they can be seen, but they cannot be measured. Indicators have been used broadly in economic, social, and environmental analysis. Vulnerability indicators should provide information regarding the susceptibility, coping capacity, and resilience of a system. I'll give you a mathematical description of risk. And this is very crude description, but it is very functional one. Risk is nothing but a function of hazard times the vulnerability times the magnitude of the consequences that happens. So risk is a function of hazard, which is a disaster risk situation, is a multiple by vulnerability, the impact that is going to happen around it, and the consequences, the loss that it is going to create around it. So vulnerability is your way to cope up with the mechanism. You are vulnerable, or you are susceptible, or you are resilient. Time. So this is what risk is all about here. A social vulnerability index is what we will look to go around it. Let's say the fragility factors and the resilience factor. Remember, fragility is where you are not able to fight out. Resilience is where you're going to fight it out. Theme, the conceptual framework is social fragility. How do personal attributes and living situation gets affected? How do finance contributes to the recovery? Resilience factor is coping capacity. How do social networks and affects vulnerability? How does access to services affect vulnerability? What are the my quantitative indicators? They are my family structures, they are my poverty, the unemployment, the disability, the home ownership, the land ownership, the distribution of wealth that is there across the society. We're talking about resilience factor. Let's say the social network, how people have trust in each other, risk perception, how educated are they are all about it, risk mitigation, how well they are prepared to fight any unforeseen situation, community preparedness, how well they are going to react as a community, and mobility. Now these are my social vulnerability index that goes around it. Component of fragility and vulnerability, how resilient you are or how fragile you are, that will determine the social vulnerability index per se. We come to the fag end of the video. Probably this is what uh, vulnerability or the risk analysis is all about it. On the x-axis is your intervention. Remember, on the x-axis I'm plotting intervention, on the y-axis I'm plotting the disaster, the risk, the hazards. Now, how do we go around it? It is your vulnerability, as in what kind of losses that you're going to face. Is it loss of health, loss of life, loss of property? How well can you fight it out as far as how susceptible you are or coping capacity you have? This is your vulnerability quotient. So what are your damage losses? It can be physical, financial, social, environmental, and the risk is all about being on space and a time factor. How well can you recoup in a short span of time, or will you take it very long span of time to recover or come back to normalcy? That is what your resilience is all about it. With this, I come to an end of this video. Thank you for watching this video till the end.